sometimes, and you forgive me. No one knows me, God, like you. You see who I am, not what I do, and you forgive me. You take all the pieces of my life, put them back together, make it all alright. Oh, you forgive me. Only you can heal my broken heart, make all things new with a brand new start. Oh, you forgive me. I try so hard to do things right, but I make the wrong choice sometimes, and you forgive me. No one knows me, God, like you. You see who I am, not what I do, and you forgive me. You take all the pieces of my life, put them back together, make it all alright. Oh, you forgive me. Only you can heal my broken heart, make all things new with a brand new start. Oh, you forgive me. You take all the pieces of my life, put them back together, make it all alright. Oh, you forgive me. Only you can heal my broken heart, make all things new with a brand new start. Oh, you forgive me. You forgive me. You forgive me.
Hello, boys and girls. I'm so excited to be here on Easter Sunday morning. How exciting! The biggest day of the Christian calendar. So excited. I'm sure you woke up this morning and you have an awesome Easter basket. It's full of candy. Some of you have even gotten little chicks that I've seen. But you know, all those things are great, but they're not what the true meaning of Easter is all about. We're going to talk about that today. Like on Wednesday when I did the resurrection eggs with you, I told you I was going to do some of the stories out of here. So we're going to go through that. But before we start here, I wanted to start with right after Palm Sunday, we go into the story and we see that Jesus is getting ready for Passover with his disciples. And the Passover was a time that even now Jews celebrate, and as well as Christians really, but it was a time when the Jews were freed from slavery in Egypt. And so they celebrate all that God did for them. So let's think about and place our minds and put ourselves in the times of the Bible. And let's think about Jesus gathering his disciples together. When they would come into a home, they would not just walk in. There were roads that were dirty and often sometimes muddy. And so a servant would wash their feet. This, of course, was not a very good job to have. Let's face it, you and I wouldn't want to have it. But Jesus started that evening by washing his disciples' feet. This was considered such a low job that many of them didn't want Jesus to wash their feet. But Jesus was trying very hard to set an example for you and for me. Because as he poured the water, they realized and they got to see that Jesus, he knelt, just imagine, he knelt before them and he took the water and he washed their feet. And then he dried it on a towel. But what he was showing them was servanthood. And servanthood is a word just that we're supposed to be there for one another. We're supposed to help one another. Don't you think that we're kind of doing that now in this time that we're living now? So it was a great example that Jesus set for us. And he did it for a reason. And so this is a great example of him showing us to be a servant and to serve one another. which we still like to do. Next, we're going to take you over to our table here. And as you can see, I have it all set up for the Last Supper. Now, I realize that there are only 6 place settings here, and there were 12 disciples, so we know that there were 13 place settings. And many of the but pictures of Jesus during this time, paintings of Jesus. He's in the center and he has his disciples around him. And we see that he takes bread, and bread was usually something that was on the tables often, and actually almost every meal. And that's why scholars think that that's why he used bread, was because he wanted us to remember something was done often, and bread was used often. But he took the bread and he broke it, and he said, "Take this bread and remember it as my body broken for you." Only the next day would we find that Jesus would be on a cross, and his body would be broken for us. He said, "Likewise, take the juice, and I would like for you to remember that my blood will be shed for you, was shed for you." And so we do this in church often, don't we? Actually, once a month, our church does it. And normally what we do is we take the piece of bread, and I'll get a little piece, and we dip it into our juice, and we eat it. This is a sign of grace. This is what the church considers to be a sacrament. Today, I don't know if you and your parents came to buy, or not to buy, but to pick up a communion cup at our church, but we had these out for everyone, and there's a little wafer at the top, and then there is some juice on the bottom. Because we as a church, even though we're not together, we're going to be together by taking communion during our service today. So you get to have that special time with your family during our church service today. This is an important part of what we do in the church to remember all that Christ has done for us. The very next place that Jesus takes us is to the Garden of Gethsemane. And of course, I couldn't get out to a real garden. And it makes me wonder sometimes in my imagination of what the garden must have been like. I think that it probably was dark. It was a dark time for Jesus. But I wanted to read out of my book here, because I like what the author of this book says. It says, "Jesus, as the Son of God, gave us a wonderful example of how important it is to pray. He often went by himself to pray to God the Father. This time, we see that Jesus asked his disciples to come with him. And there's a very good reason. He wanted his disciples to pray and keep him company. Jesus was very troubled. He knew he was going to die. Yet it wasn't the pain of dying on the cross that troubled him. Since he had never sinned, he had never felt any of the results of sin. You and I feel the results of sin, don't we? But Jesus didn't. He would have to feel God's disapproval of sin. However, Jesus was willing to do anything God wanted him to do. He knew that dying on the cross was part of his Father's plan. So he went to the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples to pray. But his disciples fell asleep. Not just once, but 3 times. Do you ever get tired when you have trying to pray? I know I do. It's hard to be strong when you're tired, isn't it? Even Jesus' disciples were weak when they tried to be strong on their own, apart from God. This is why it's a good reminder to us that we cannot be strong on our own. We need to pray and ask our Father's strength, just like Jesus did. And Jesus, we find him in the garden, and he prayed that God's will be done, that he would be able to submit himself. And you and I need to do that as well. We need to submit ourselves to God, and we want his will above what we want. Then I'm going to take you over here for a second, and this is the most important of so far. Not the most important, and I'll tell you why in a second, but it is the most important so far. As you can see, I have the cross that is in our main sanctuary. It's in the big church, and we have it with the Christ candle. And the Christ candle is celebrated on Easter by being brought in. If you remember on Friday in our Good Friday service, it was silenced, it was quieted, it was burnt out, and then it went to dark. Even in our video that Pastor Casey made for us, we kind of had that sense of darkness, didn't we? But yet on Sunday morning, Easter, today, we celebrate the fact that no longer is that candle in dark, but it's lit. So every Sunday, we celebrate Jesus and his resurrection, and the candle sits in front of this cross. But as I went to get this cross today, I found that the crown was on it. This saddens me a little bit. Whoops. This saddens me a little bit. And the reason that it saddens me is look at that crown. I know I wouldn't want to wear that crown. Last Sunday morning, you and I were celebrating Palm Sunday, and I put a real king's crown on my head, didn't I? And yet, out of mockery, out of making fun of Jesus, they gave him a crown of thorns. I couldn't even imagine having that on my head. Mr. Richard and I have this on our Christmas tree every year, and we hide it. It's an ornament that is supposed to be hidden, that only the family knows where it is. And the reason for that is because we know that on Christmas, he was born to die. And so it's a reminder of the whole story of Jesus. So we put it on our tree, and we usually put it way back in the back, right by the root of the tree. But I dug it out today so that I could share it with you. Because when we think of nails, we think of the nails that you and I use like in our house. But that's not what he had. He was placed, these were placed in his wrist, and they were placed in his feet. And there were 3 nails. Remember on Wednesday we talked about how the 3 nails made a cross. But that's pretty amazing, isn't it? That he did this for you and for me. So I have these Lego, not really Legos, but they're blocks. And we sit there and we think, well, why did Jesus do all of this for you and for me? All of you know Adam and Eve. We've talked about Adam and Eve a lot. And when Adam and Eve were created, there was a oneness with God, wasn't there? But then Adam and Eve sinned, right? And when they sinned, that separated them from God. So now there was a gap between God and mankind, you and me. And so there had to be a price paid for that sin, because that's how things were done. And so Jesus was that ultimate price for you and me. And he bridged the gap between mankind and God. And now, if like on a bridge, I could start here, I'm going to walk across the bridge to get to the other side, which is God. And that's what Jesus did for us. He bridged the gap. Now the story would be very sad, wouldn't it, if it just ended here. But guess what? It doesn't. The amazing thing is that we go over to our tomb. Now I know what you're thinking. Wow, Pastor Christy, that's not a very good tomb, is it? I understand, and I'll agree that it's not. I went outside and got a rock, and I know that you know what that rock is. That rock represents the stone that was rolled away, right? And so we find Mary Magdalene, and she came to put scents on Jesus, like smelly fragrances on Jesus's body. But when she got there, what happened? There was no body in the tomb. the tomb was empty. At first, what was so amazing about this story was that the Roman government made sure that the seal on the grave was locked, that it was sealed up, so that, because they thought, well, they'll steal his body. And so that was broken. That seal was broken. The grave was open. They had soldiers that were there, and those soldiers were supposed to guard the tomb. But they weren't there when Mary Magdalene got there. Mary Magdalene saw an angel, and the angel said, he's not here. The tomb was empty. Go and tell others he is risen. And because Jesus rose from the dead, you and I have a promise of eternity. That is why we celebrate Easter. That is why every single Sunday that Christ candle is lit. Why? Because Jesus is alive. We serve a living God who loves us and cares for us. So this right here, this was folded. The towel that Jesus had was folded. Why? Because Jesus wanted them to know that he was not robbed, that his body was not robbed, that it was folded to represent that he was gone, and that there was an order to it all. Praise God. He is alive, and we get the opportunity to celebrate that. I am so grateful, and I'm so thankful for that. The one thing that our song that we had, that we sang, that was forgiven, that's the amazing thing, is that in all of this story, it was to bring us back to Christ and forgive us of our sins. Praise be to God, he has risen, and he is indeed alive and well in our hearts. Pastor Christy loves you. Looking forward to seeing you soon. God bless.